Great to see everybody here today, and welcome to our session on the rise of the privacy operations leader. This has become a very big topic in the area of privacy and data protection. For those of you listening and watching today, we know that when the first rounds of privacy laws were passed, especially starting with GDPR, in the first years, it was a lot about legal interpretation and high-level understandings for especially the general counsel's office and for the executive leadership, what do principles mean and how do you reconcile at the legal level between, for example, a European-style data protection regime and the US or others? And today we're going to be covering a growing area in the area of data protection and privacy, which is the rise of our leaders in organizations all over the world who actually run and implement our privacy programs. I'm Justin Antonipillai. I'm the CEO of WireWheel. And we're here today with three fantastic leaders in the area of privacy operations to talk about what this movement has been about actually taking the principles in privacy laws in Europe and in the US and actually implementing them in companies all around the world. I'm going to start with a quick introduction of our panel. First of all, from Zillow Group, Lisa Barksdale, the Director of Privacy. Lisa, great to see you here today.
Thank you, Justin.
Terrific. Thank you for joining us. And we are going to give our viewers here today a little bit of background on each of you. So I'm going to run through quick introductions of our panel, and then we're going to get to jump in to hear a little bit from each of you of how you actually got started in this field. Also joining us today from Yahoo, Katie Pimentel, who's the Assistant General Counsel for Global Privacy. Katie, great to see you here today.
Hi, Justin. Great to be here.
Yep. Thank you for joining us. And Tara Jones, who's the Legal Services Senior Manager for Global Privacy at Yahoo. Tara, great to see you.
Thanks. Great to see you also.
Terrific. Okay. Well, first of all, we are going to jump right in. And our goal here is to not only get a sense of the operations and privacy leaders for our viewers here today, but to jump in with some introductory topics to give our viewers a little bit of a sense of when you move as an organization from reading and interpreting the law, and you start asking, what does this mean to me? And how do we actually get these principles implemented? What are some critical things that we need to think about? So Lisa, if you don't mind, I'm going to turn it over to you first. Would you mind giving our viewers a little bit of a sense of your background first, and how did you really get into the area of privacy and data protection?
Thank you, Justin. So I kind of fell into it. I started a career in insurance and then quickly decided that that was not the life for me and moved into just understanding operations in its totality. And then went to a startup almost 14 years ago around just lead generation and understanding what that is. And the COO came to me one day and said, there's this thing called privacy. Do you think it's something that you would be interested in? And if you do decide to take it on, don't screw it up. And I'm like, oh, okay, that sounds interesting. Let's do some diving. And then I immediately went to the IAPP, which is a fantastic resource in understanding what privacy is, how you want to play a role within the industry. So I got recruited by financial services, TD Bank, and then went to Citi, and then was recruited by Zillow. So it's just really been a whirlwind. I can't believe it's been almost 14 years. But what I've decided is I understand it. I love it. I'm passionate about it. It changes all the time. And the operational side of it, to me, is the most intriguing. You can interpret the privacy laws often, right? You need to understand what they mean, but the business really wants to know how it's going to impact them. So what? We have a new law. What does it mean to us? And that's the part that fascinates me.
Yeah, and by the way, when we go through everybody's introduction, and I would say this is true for myself as well, Lisa, there's so many folks that were doing, sort of had a role in their organization, especially years ago, that was not privacy. It was in litigation. It might have been in other adjacent areas like insurance or others, that this became part of their portfolio. And then it became an area where they were passionate about it or interested in it. And, so as we go through and we introduce Katie and Tara as well, I'd love to hear if any of that resonates for you on your journey as we get to your part of the discussion. Because I too, I was in an adjacent area, Lisa, and the combination for me of understanding the law, learning the technology, understanding the multi-jurisdictional side of it, and then how do you operationalize it, has been one of the things that have really kept me interested in the area. But before we jump in, to our other introductions, I know, Lisa, from your perspective, we were going to start with a couple of observations in terms of implementing privacy and privacy programs. So let me hop, I think it's the next slide is the first one, right? For you,
Okay.
Lisa. Okay. So turn it back over to you, Lisa, for a quick introduction on a couple of topics here.
Sure. So, onboarding into privacy and really understanding it, no matter what industry you're in, there are a couple of fundamental things that you absolutely need to do, right? You need to make sure that you do a risk and gap analysis of your area. What are you absolutely dealing with? Understand what that is, understand all of the key players, and then come up with your framework. So, when I entered Zillow, I did just that. And then I said, you know what, these are the 8 things that you see here that we need to focus on. The privacy notice management, looking at our privacy notices, making sure that they're comprehensive, they make sense. I've been in situations where we've had like 50 different notices, which is really hard to operationalize and make sense. So you kind of want to drill down on that. Then your regulatory initiatives, of course, CCPA was one of them, but now you have all these other states that are coming on. And since we don't have a federal regulation, how are we managing through that? What is the business currently doing to comply? And where can we find synergies with these additional laws coming on board? Reporting. I love reporting because it shows what we're doing, how we're doing it, and how we're performing against it. And it allows the senior leaders to see what that actually looks like. They don't want to see a whole bunch of nothing that they can't solve for or understand. So reporting is extremely important. Policy management, making sure that not only internally from your privacy programs that you have a solid internal privacy policy, but also your businesses. Risk and controls, making sure that you have a comprehensive monitoring and testing program in place to understand all of your processes and controls for your business and how they adhere. Make sure you become very friendly with internal audit, understanding the existing issues that you may have. Meetings, forums, councils, I think those are important, and then coming up with an overall governance routine. Next slide. So these are just our, privacy regulations that we focus on. I'm sure this is all familiar to everyone, but I like to always include it in my publications with the businesses and the enterprise so that they know what we're focused on. And it kind of just shows the delineation between privacy and the other compliance regulations.
And of course, Lisa, these first two slides that we walked through you've covered them as a perfect introduction, but they're critical to understanding how to operationalize. There's certain parts of privacy that are part of the everyday life of a privacy operations leader, and this is a terrific outline. And then understanding what are the jurisdictions, what are the countries that matter to you. And at any moment, you may have to revise that, but this really does give you a good framework to start your scope of what you do next.
And Justin, you hit the nail on the head. If you want to go back just to that other slide, just one more point on that. It's with the regulations and identifying them that I was able to create a regulatory matrix document. I think having a regulatory matrix document is extremely important. And the why is you look at all the regulations, you look at your enterprise in its totality, all of your business lines, and you map them back to the regulations to understand which businesses are applicable, right? Who do you need to focus on? And then, of course, you don't want to boil the ocean. You also apply a risk rating to that. And then it'll ultimately help you manage your monitoring and testing and creating a plan for the next year.
Terrific. Now, on to the next one.
Then you have your privacy principles, right? So we outline all of these principles within our internal privacy policy. I thought it was important for the businesses and our target audience to understand these principles. Transparency, of course, relates to our privacy notice. Proportionality, of course, relates to we don't want to over retain, right? We want to keep what we need to keep and get rid of what we don't need to keep. Retention, I think, is important. We're going to be taking on record retention management. I think that ties directly to CCPA and some other regulations to ensure that we're doing that. And then sharing, are we sharing with who we were supposed to, working very closely with our vendor management to make sure that we're sharing what we need to share and then retaining what we need to retain. So privacy principles, I think, is a great way of outlining your internal privacy policy for your companies.
I agree with you. And you can get these kinds of sources. Your document is a perfect one for this. But if you run through something like the Privacy Shield framework or other summaries of the Federal Information Privacy Principles, it does give you an outline like that ties back to this, Lisa, as well.
Absolutely. And then one of my favorite slides, I do get questions like, okay, all your slides, they make sense, but how do we really operationalize this? What are the people? Who are the people? How do we organize that? So here's, my role summary, right? Just the privacy manager. This person really aligns with the CPO or the privacy director around knowing everything, right? It's really your lead PMO. They may have some subject matter expertise in certain things, but they really kind of get things over the line for you. Your business relationship manager, this person will have a really solid relationship with the business partners. They're responsible for developing, creating the PIA, implementing that, working with your business change committees, sometimes even your vendor change committees, regulatory change committees, but they have that intimate relationship with your businesses. Privacy legal, we can't live without it, right? They start, usually those are the ones that will create your standards within your organization, right? To help empower the businesses to better understand the regulations. They will do the contract work, the M&A, all of those things. Your data manager, definitely key. And I think this role really came out of CCPA and GDPR because they really work with the record of processing activity, understanding the data mapping, and they also work closely with data governance, right? Because data governance also understands the data within your organization. So there's a tight relationship there. And then monitoring and testing. As I stated before, in reference to that regulatory matrix document, the monitoring and testing manager works very closely also with the businesses, but they will be documenting and identifying controls and processes to ensure that they're adhering to the privacy regulations that are applicable to their organizations. So again, a very big role. And all of these roles usually have 1, 2, 3 analysts under them because of the roles are so large and there's so much work to do around them.
Once again, that's terrific, Lisa. This is giving a great overview, I think, as a starting point, Lisa, in terms of what are the critical elements you have to think about around the activities, the jurisdictions, the roles and responsibilities. And before I pivot over to speak with Katie here for a moment and ask about her background, I know, Lisa, one of the things you've been quite focused on is just also in operationalizing, understanding the relationship between your privacy office and the business and how important that is to running a program. Do you mind speaking about that for a minute before we move to our next topic?
Absolutely. So one of the things that I think is a challenge for a lot of privacy programs is headcount, right? We need to try to work from a center of excellence and supporting that, supporting your businesses. One of the things that we created was in-business privacy champions. And these are roles that actually sit in the business, and they're a liaison between the business and the privacy office. We've tasked them to work very closely with our in-business privacy managers. They also work with our monitoring and testing managers, but they are the SMEs of their business. They understand their businesses. And then we have taken the position of educating them and training them on privacy and how it impacts their areas. So we work together collaboratively to ensure that we are more proactive instead of reactive to their businesses, to ensure that we're operationalizing privacy the best way we can, and not be a bottleneck in any of their processes, but more of a toll gate of some sort to ensure that all of the privacy risks that are applicable to their areas are being assessed appropriately and that we have the right resources to do it.
Yeah, I mean, again, really important point. And fundamentally, all around your business, whether it's your software developers, your marketing teams, your sales teams, your analytics teams, they don't live and breathe privacy. And this is an area where the language can just be confusing, like what is a controller? What is a processor? Who owns a system? What is a data transfer? I mean, this is not language that you want your business committing cycles to learning. And so understanding how to bridge between them and setting up this concept of here's the place you go to get the right information, Lisa, can be really important to sort of taking that next step. And I've been really, as we've worked together with you, I've been really, really impressed with the way that the organization has thought about that at Zillow.
It's really important to have that partnership because I view the business as our clients, right? I mean, that's who we're servicing, that's who we're working with, and we want to be an important part of the success of any organization from a privacy perspective. So just trying to be collaborative in all instances and really think ahead and get information to the business that they may not necessarily be considering in helping them to be successful in their respective areas. So it's really been great. I'm not going to tell you that it's not challenging at times because folks sometimes just don't understand it. They don't get it and they don't want to. But I think constant conversation and communication is helpful.
Totally agree. And we're going to come back to this subject in a few minutes with Tara as well. So why don't we move forward in the conversation for a moment to Katie. So Katie, we're going to cover some really important topics that are coming up in operationalization, especially because at some point your privacy team is doing their work and somebody is going to take a look at it. And the concept of an internal audit and frameworks becomes really important. But before we hop to that side, Katie, do you mind giving a quick introduction of yourself and how'd you get into this area?
Sure. I'm Katie Pimentel, and I sort of happenstance, somewhat similar to Lisa, got into privacy, much newer to privacy, and that I cut my teeth on GDPR. Before I was an attorney, I was actually a financial analyst and ended up going to law school part-time while working as an analyst during the day, and really enjoyed the risk aspect of finances, of the law. And then getting into technology and working with different technology companies as an attorney, I was doing transactions, I was doing technology agreements, things like that. And then when GDPR came on the scene, I was tasked with, for a technology company, to really understand and dig into the GDPR and understand how it's going to impact the company, what they need to do, global organization, understanding everything from, to Justin's point, like what's a controller, what's a transfer. These are all new terms for the attorneys, at least for me, and as well as the business. And so really being able to dig into that over the course of probably about 2 years to implement that and understand it really piqued my interest in privacy generally. was very fortunate to be able to move over within that organization to the privacy department within the legal team, and then learn obviously a lot more about not just the GDPR, but that there's actually privacy regulations all over the world. Who knew? So, and then CCPA came on the scene and things like that. So really just getting more involved in the global privacy landscape, understanding how that impacts technology organizations, advertising organizations. And I'm sure a few folks are aware of some of the challenges in Europe with advertising. So there's a lot going on there. It's super exciting. And I fully support Lisa in the IAPP is definitely a great organization to learn more, to get more resources, understanding, not affiliated, but it's really a great organization.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And Katie, again, the message really resonates in terms of coming to the field from another field and having it become a very important part of your portfolio, and now to shift from your background, Katie, into the discussion topic, we're really seeing, as WireWheel has worked with Yahoo, you see a move all across our industry, in which years ago, when GDPR first came out, there was a movement to conduct the first rounds of assessments connected to kind of a business process, which is what a lot of the language was in GDPR. And so it was almost a GDPR driven first round of exercises we saw years ago. And now you're seeing companies, as they've matured their programs, start to bring in, frameworks and other audit teams to look at their privacy programs, much like audits and internal audits have really been used in areas of finance. Katie, for example, Sarbanes-Oxley is now 20-something years old, and you see internal auditors auditing the internal controls for Sarbanes-Oxley so that you can have certifications. And obviously, the concept of internal audits and external audits and frameworks are widely used in the area of security with the NIST framework and ISO frameworks, and then internal audits. So I really think, Katie, this is one area where your team has thought about it. So do you mind walking through the concepts of moving from assessments to frameworks and then internal audit for a bit?
Sure. Yeah. So when we talk about frameworks, it can be a little overwhelming, and there's a few different frameworks out there. NIST is one that we're very familiar with. NIST has long had a security framework. They developed their privacy framework in 2020, and one of the benefits of the framework is very pragmatic. It's an organizational tool. So when you start to think about, okay, we had GDPR, then we had CCPA, multi-states are coming online, but then there are a lot of other jurisdictions around the world really starting to enforce their own privacy laws and their own regulations around how data is processed, both within their own jurisdiction, as well as whether their data subjects are being monitored or whatnot throughout the world. And so we really look to a framework to understand, how can we take all of these regulations, all of these obligations, and boil them down to something that we can actually pragmatically implement within our organization? And that's where a framework really does come in handy. And to Justin's point, frameworks have been around for a very long time. SOX, Sarbanes-Oxley, is notorious for implementing and from a regulation perspective, legally requiring organizations to implement certain things. Fortunately, privacy regulations haven't gotten to that point, but the regulations, the framework will really help to not only just boil a lot of this down into more usable concepts and usable things that you can implement, it's going to scale with your organization as well. It's going to help you create an agnostic approach to implementing a lot of these different regulations within your organization. So for example, Lisa talked about the regulation matrix. spot on, right? Like that's exactly what we would look to do within a framework. So we would call it a regulation crosswalk within the framework. So we would take the framework and understand from your business what the priorities are, what regulations might apply to your business, and then map those to the framework in a crosswalk. And so understanding, okay, for GDPR or CCPA or even LGPD in Brazil, which pieces of those regulations apply to your business, and then what parts of those do you want to develop controls around? What parts of those do you want to ensure that you can test compliance with against those controls and against that regulation? So that's really some of the benefits of working within a framework. So
that makes a lot of sense. I'll keep going here, Katie, and then come back.
So when you look at a framework, you want to look at a few different things within your organization. So you want to understand what your needs are within the organization, right? Like, so there's going to be certain things that are higher risk for your organization, as well as for your industry. So certain industries may have to look at HIPAA, for example, in the US, others may not. So there might be different risk profiles that your organization or your industry are dealing with in different jurisdictions. And so you really want to understand what those are. You also need to look at, obviously, the regulatory landscape, and not just from a sense of, okay, GDPR applies in the EU and LGPD applies in Brazil. It's actually much more than that, because different jurisdictions are really enforcing their laws in different ways. So we have the GDPR in the EU, but then France's CNIL is actually enforcing their e-privacy directive in a much stronger way. And so even within Europe, different jurisdictions are starting to enforce different rules within their individual countries in different ways. And so really understanding what that regulatory landscape is and how that applies to your business, these are all things that you can bring into a regulatory crosswalk within a framework, and it'll really just help you organize where you need to focus on what you need to implement first. Like Lisa said, you can't boil the ocean, so you really have to understand where that focus needs to be.
Katie, that again makes a lot of sense. And Lisa, I know you will have to be dropping today for a moment. So, we've spoken a lot about the concepts of interacting with the business, and you've talked about, the crosswalk framework that Katie has mentioned. Before you leave, I guess I'll ask you one final question as we transition out and go back to Katie. How do you know, on your side, that your program's working? Like, how do you think about it, to pick up on Katie's point?
Great question. I think getting a pulse on your program after you've stood it up is probably as critical as standing up the program, right? You put all these processes in place and you set up all these resources and you think, all right, I got everything covered, but nobody's adopted the PIA. You have a slow amount of coming in. People are failing their monitoring and testing. The controls aren't working. So I think, sometimes you can either get an external company to come out and do a health diagnostic on your program, or you work closer with internal audit to see what their schedule looks like. But I think it's important to get that health diagnostic on there, right? You want to make sure that it's working. I think reporting is critical, and make sure that you're looking at it with fresh eyes, that we have 53 businesses out there. We have less than 25 PIAs happening, and I'm seeing a lot more work happening. It hasn't adopted like it should be. So you want to really look at your metrics and ensure that they make sense. And if they don't, dive in there and figure out why. This will definitely feed into your relationships with the business and your respective areas to continue to work together to make sure that it's actually working. You would hate for the regulators to come in and let you know it's not working before you identify it yourself.
Lisa, thank you so much. Perfect pivot in here, and thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
We'll be seeing you, I'm sure, with our community again soon.
Absolutely. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. All right, Katie, back to you.
All right, so that was a perfect segue. So, for privacy governance program, really the sort of big picture benefits, right? It's scalable, repeatable, and testable. Well, how do you make that work? It's really based a lot what Lisa was saying. So it's about developing controls. And so this is where leveraging some of the learnings from SOX and some of the learnings from that regulation around developing controls, around implementing and testing those controls can really be beneficial. Now, if you're a smaller organization or you've not been public in any, at any during the lifespan of the organization, and you don't have really any experience with SOX or with that type of a program, there are a lot of resources out there that can assist with that. But really leveraging that type of controls drafting and that type of controls implementation is critical to ensuring that you can understand exactly what Lisa's saying. You can understand what that program is doing. You can understand where the gaps are. And then that's the only way, from my experience, that your program is truly going to be testable. And without testability, you can't then, with a straight face at least, go to a regulator and say, sure, my program's working. We have, the PIAs in place and they're being recorded and they're being implemented in the right way and all the processes are being followed. That internal audit team is so critical and such a critical relationship for the success of your privacy governance program. And so one other key, in addition to controls, one of the other key areas of a privacy governance program is understanding your data. And the record of processing assessments, or they're also called record of processing activities, ROPAs in short, these are the things that are typically used, the forms or the format questionnaire that's used to really understand the who, what, why, where, and how of your information processing. It's going to help you understand if there's areas of non-compliance or high risk. So for example, if you've developed your ROPA, you've had your business folks fill it out, you've got all the data coming back in, and you see, okay, we're retaining genetic data, we're processing genetic data, first of all, we didn't even know we were processing that, for example, and we're retaining it for 6 years, and we're using it for marketing purposes. Might be a red flag, right? Like, so these are the things, obviously it's an extreme example, but these are the things that a ROPA is really going to help you understand where there are privacy related vulnerabilities within your business. Now, I will say one practice tip here: when you are starting to dig into ROPAs, when you are starting to dig into developing controls, I would highly recommend doing these under privilege. When you start lifting up rocks within your organization, you don't always know what's going to sort of be underneath there, right? Like, you hope and you think there's, clearly people are trying to do the right thing. No one, for the most part, is trying to do anything nefarious within your organization, but things happen, processes go undone, and you start to uncover some things that you probably won't want to necessarily be discoverable. The whole purpose of uncovering these is so you can identify them and fix them. So highly recommend doing these things under privilege. It'll pay dividends for you in the long run as you're developing your program and you're addressing these things, you're fixing them, and you're putting these types of programs in place.
Katie, again, great advice, very practical advice. And when you see it, it's not only the ROPA, it's not only privileged, but it's also what data are you actually getting out of a ROPA, and starting to look at it early. What are you seeing? Where are the risks, and where are the things that worry you?
Exactly. Yeah. And I think we could actually probably skip the next slide. And I think that's a great segue into Tara's project launch.
Perfect. Well, Tara, great to see you today, and we'll come back with some questions here in a moment. But Tara, I know you've been focused on the pure operationalization of these programs. They touch a lot of parts of the business, and you do need to have a good framework and tools and relationship with the business. So maybe I'll turn it over to you. Tara, could you speak for a minute about how you got into this area, and then jump into your observations of how do you interact with the business?
Yeah, thanks so much. So I'm Tara Jones, and I've actually been with our company for about 23 years. And so I've kind of moved all over the place. I landed in the legal department probably about 16 years ago, and I spent probably a decade, a little more, working in e-discovery. After about 10 years dealing with e-discovery and the variances that come with it, I thought it might be a decent idea to see what's out there. And I knew that privacy was super hot right now. So I moved over to privacy just about a year ago, starting to work for Katie, which has been an amazing transition out of e-discovery and into privacy. So yeah, that's kind of how I got here. And so maybe I could talk just a minute about the project launch and what we had to do to kind of get to this place. So basically we started this project by just using a spreadsheet, which is typically how things generally begin. I lived this through e-discovery, how we started our e-discovery process just on a spreadsheet, and then quickly realized that we needed a tool to help us kind of move this process along. So back into privacy, over the course of about a year of nights and weekends, we were able to finally get the project off the ground and build enough evidence to defend our business justification to present to our executives to get the buy-off. So that would allow us to analyze the data by putting it into a tool that would give us the specific purposes that we would need to understand when it comes to reporting to regulators. So this is how we're able to justify the use of WireWheel. And we began working with them to tackle this project. We ended up needing more than 1,200 assessments for our business. This is quickly when we learned that the leadership buy-in was not only a nice to have, it was an absolute requirement. And I'm sharing this example with you to let you know that even in a multi-billion-dollar company, we still started at the grassroots with these spreadsheets. And so maybe if we can move to the next slide, we can talk a little bit about the communication that's required between the business unit owners and the privacy group. We had to be very clear with our business owners so they would understand the what and the why regarding our request for them, because we were asking them to disclose anything and everything that they knew or possibly knew about their specific components. We've learned that just the sheer act of communication between privacy and the business, it makes everything so much easier. I think even speaking back a little bit on my e-discovery days, I think the biggest problem between any business unit and any entity in legal was just the communication, and it's almost as if we're each speaking to each other in a different language. The business owners tend to be a bit defensive because they don't really understand why we're asking so many questions about their business, and privacy or e-discovery tend to get a bit defensive because we're just trying to help the business. So opening the line of communication and explaining in detail, but also in somewhat of a layman's terms, what we're doing and why we're asking for this information, it tends to help the process of, I don't know, 100%. They just want to understand, for the most part, our business owners want to understand why we're doing what we're doing, and they want to do everything they can to help us get in the place where we're completely compliant. We're not having to ask questions every 2 weeks about various things. So I think the communication piece of this is super key.
No, that's a great insight, Tara. And I mean, your team does such a phenomenal job with this, but it is an investment, really, to get it right.
Oh yeah, it is. I mean, we have office hours set up whenever we're doing a different deep dive into our ROPAs. And we are a global company, so we will do office hours at 9 and 10 o'clock p.m. just to make sure that we're able to reach everybody that may have questions. We definitely offer ourselves up at all times of the day and night to answer questions, because we don't want our business owners to feel like that that they're a burden, or we're trying to make them stop using the components that they need to run their business. We just want to make sure that they understand what the deal is. And again, that 15 or 20 minutes on a call with them makes a world of difference.
No doubt about it. And then, obviously the next step was things like compiling the data and analyzing the data. And how do you think about those steps, Tara?
Yeah, and I think when I came on to the team, I was fast trying to learn everything that I could, but I kind of was able to focus on these ROPAs to understand a little bit more about how the business operates. It's the compilation of the data that when that data begins to filter in, and then we have to figure out just what to do with the data. For what purpose are we analyzing it for? How are we going to analyze it? What tools are we going to use for that analysis? Those are questions that need to be, you need to have at least a preliminary answer before this data starts coming in, because what do you do with the data? Something to also remember, to Katie's point about working this process under privilege, is once the data is known, you cannot unknow what you now know. So you need to have it under privilege, first of all, so you're protected. But secondly, you should have a plan in place to determine what is going to happen with this data once it is compiled. How are you going to analyze it? What are you going to report on it? What needs to happen with the data? And I think this is just kind of a bigger piece of it that is very easily overwhelming, because there is so much data that you have to understand. You need to make sure that all of your data that's been retrieved, is it all in compliance? If it's not in compliance, how do you get it in compliance? What do you have to do to work with the business to ensure that everything you now know is exactly the way it should be? Are you, within your retention matrix? If not, how do you get there? Is there going to be an exception process? If so, who's going to be in charge of the exceptions? Who's going to have to approve or deny? If it's denied, who's going to work with the business to make sure that, that we're able to still do business?
So Tara, this is really, really thoughtful. And I guess I'll ask one question to both you and Katie. In the first couple of years around privacy implementation post GDPR, that a lot of the marketing was almost around privacy or implementation, almost always focused almost exclusively on what is your data. But you've just covered that actually focusing on compliance is about a lot of different components of a privacy program. And what is your data is actually just one component of it. You've just covered, for example, Tara, and you covered this as well, Katie, that the context of collection becomes very important. Understanding the permitted uses of data and what systems people are accessing it is a pretty significant area of risk. Understanding for each system, or however you're thinking of it, asset, system, business process, what is the retention policy and how is it being implemented? These are among the issues you just covered, Tara, that are really important from a risk perspective. And so we have seen, as a practical issue, a move away from looking just at what is the data to trying to understand these other parts of a privacy program. And you covered a lot that's critical to that. Do you mind if I get your reflection on what I just covered in terms of moving from just what is the data to everything else?
Yeah, I think that's the biggest piece of it that was, I don't want to say a shocker to me as the kind of the newbie into privacy, but just really having a firm hand on what it is, what the data is, but also how it's used and how it's retained or stored, or those things are huge. And it takes a lot of work to really understand that from component to component to component, because you have to have a little bit more than just an elementary understanding of what that piece of software or what that component does within the company to be able to help the business owner define where it is, where it sits, what it does, and how we are able to control it. And of course, I'll move on to Katie to get her opinion on it. But it's a lot of work to understand it and analyze it, and to really be familiar, with what all of this is. It's a lot to know.
Absolutely agree. And one of the things that I think for us was it probably shouldn't have been, but at least for me, it was a little bit remedial, was really understanding, and it came very much to the forefront, is the harmonization of the privacy obligations with all of your other obligations, especially around things like retention, right? Like, so you look at your financial laws and regulations that you have in retention and types of data that you are legally obligated to retain there, versus from a privacy perspective, the data minimization principles and things like that. Really being able to harmonize those concepts across your business. This is another area where, again, the framework just really became critical for us to be able to harmonize those obligations, because a lot of times they did really, they didn't match, right? They didn't mesh at all. And so we had, and Tara talked a little bit about our exception process. We had to actually build in a process to document where maybe a processing or a retention is not within the bounds of a particular privacy regulation because of another obligation that our business has that preempts that privacy obligation. And so understanding that and documenting that is just so critical. And it's a critical component of your privacy program to really make sure that where there are things that are going to maybe go against what the privacy regulation requires for your jurisdiction in particular. And we especially found this both in the US and, interestingly enough, in Taiwan as well, where they have a lot of financial regulations that don't necessarily line up with the privacy regulations. And so really understanding that and being able to harmonize that is going to be a critical component to the success of your program.
Katie, that's a great point. It really is. And when you stand back, I've put up the slide to just give our viewers a little bit of a summary as we hit the last few minutes of today's presentation, that, as you actually operationalize the program, doing at least a high level risk and gap analysis can be important. And this is, as you just said, Katie and Tara, you covered, this is about a lot more than just what is your data. I mean, data discovery can be helpful sometimes, but it can also be an enormous distraction from all of the other risks that are available. Knowing your business control environment and understanding it and how it ties to a framework. Tara, you and Katie and Lisa all covered the need to actually engage with your business and finding the key stakeholders. Be able to look and understand the basic data in an asset inventory or a record of processing, however you call it. In Europe, obviously, sometimes it's referred to as an Article 30 inventory. It's giving you a high level understanding of what your data is and what the systems are. But as you both covered, it's about retention and use and access and what are the permitted uses. And that combination of insights gives you an understanding of some of your risks. And that allows you then move to prioritize the privacy issues based on the risks and to go tackle and remediate. And that's a phenomenal set of insights that I think Katie, you, Tara, and Lisa have given about the practical implications of operationalizing your privacy program. But anyway, Katie, I really appreciate the way you phrased it in these last couple of moments in terms of how thinking about it as more than just your data, but here are some critical other risks that you've seen in a ROPA process.
Yeah, definitely. And, it's really making sure, I think we can't iterate this enough, that having those internal relationships with your business folks, having those internal relationships, not just with the people who are filling out the ROPAs, which is critical, but also with your other functions, your finance functions, your audit functions, because privacy is something that, as we've learned probably the hard way, is going to permeate the entire business. It's not just one part of the business or another. It really is the entire business. And you really do, having those relationships with every function within the business and organization is going to be really critical. It's a critical piece of the success of your privacy program.
I completely agree. Well, look, I know we'll be speaking more. I think, as we said, in the privacy operations area, there's a lot that our community can learn from folks like you, Katie, and Tara, and Lisa, who are actually implementing and have put programs in place. I hope that you'll be willing to join us again to share your insights with the community and with the broader community of companies that are just starting on that journey. And I do want to thank you both for appearing here with us today to share your insights on these critical areas of, as we call it, the rise of the privacy operations leader in companies all across the country. So thank you both, Tara and Katie, for your time here today.
Thanks so much, Justin, for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you both. And, for those of us, as we wrap up, I want to thank our entire team at WireWheel, who support our customers, but also have been building an across the board privacy automation platform to help our customers with privacy operations. And then, of course, the day-to-day operationalization, I've got my tongue tied today, of trust, access, and consent solutions as well. And I want to thank you all very much for joining us today, and we'll see you on our next session. Thanks, Katie. Thanks, Tara.
Thank you.
Thank you.